This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 816 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. Last week's Sleeper Show was definitely better than the Week 4 one. It was a nice bounce back. I talked up Sam Howell. He had a big game. Jaleel McLaughlin and Tajay Spears were both top 10 running back options. Rashee Rice scored a touchdown. Zach Ertz did too. And Josh Downs, a sub 10% play, he was a top 20 option in PPR formats. Now, I didn't get everything right. That's never going to happen. Both Josh Dobbs and Zach Wilson, they were bad streaming choices. Michael Wilson didn't give us an encore. Wan'Dale Robinson wasn't used very creatively once again. That limited his upside despite a 20% target share. Overall, though, it was a pretty good week. I'll give it a 5 out of 10. Let's try to be even better here in Week 6. We'll kick things off this week the same way that we did with last week's show, and that's with Sam Howell as a quarterback streamer. He fits the criteria of being a player rostered in 10% to 50% of Yahoo leagues for this tier of players. Howell's facing Atlanta. The Falcons have actually been a below average matchup for quarterbacks in adjusted fantasy points allowed this year. That's not a good thing for Howell. But what I'm intrigued by is that the Commanders have been very bad at keeping Howell upright. And Atlanta isn't very good at getting to the quarterback. Quarterback sacks aren't just an offensive line thing. This is on Sam Howell too. But the Commanders have given up a bottom 5 pressure rate in football this year. The Falcons are bottom 5 in pressure rate defensively. So the matchup is actually decent for him. And honestly, Howell's been low-key not bad in fantasy. He's averaged 16.4 standard fantasy points per game. That's not great, but that includes a contest in a much more difficult matchup than this one where he faced the Bills. He scored less than a point in that game. So I think Howell's a pretty solid play. I also think that Baker Mayfield's a solid play. Mayfield's given us a top 12 QB1 performance in 2 of 4 games this year. Now he faces a Lions team that ranks as a top 10 favorable matchup in adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks. There's a chance for a pass-heavy script for Tampa because Detroit's a good team and they face the 3rd highest pass rate in football this year. So Baker Mayfield makes sense. Now moving on to running back, I guess I should just talk about this Dolphins backfield in general. There's no Devon Achane. So Raheem Mostert, he's the RB1. You should play Raheem Mostert. It's a great matchup. He's going to see a lot of volume. But because it's a great matchup against the Panthers, and because Miami's a 13.5 point favorite, there are going to be other running backs involved more than likely. Will it be Jeff Wilson? Well, at the time of this recording, I have no idea if he's going to be ready to play. And I'm not sure the Dolphins are going to rush him back in a matchup where they could be leading, where they're big favorites. Chris Brooks and Savon Ahmed are the other 2 running backs to focus on. Brooks played ahead of Ahmed last week because of his special teams ability. But Ahmed played ahead of Brooks back in Week 1 when Devon Achane was out. And Brooks was only on special teams in Week 2 when the 4 running backs were all together. So my best guess today, right now, is that Savon Ahmed gets the 2nd most touches in this Dolphins backfield this weekend. Because Jeff Wilson might not be ready. Chris Brooks, as much as he's intriguing, he's been a special teamer. And Ahmed does sort of fit the Devon Achane mold. But this is subject to change. Hopefully we learn a little bit as the week goes on. For now, as a deep sleeper, it's Savon Ahmed. As a not-so-deep sleeper, it would be Jeff Wilson. Kenneth Gainwell's not the lead back for Philadelphia, that's DeAndre Swift, but he's averaged a 26% running back rush share per game over his last 2. That's led to 11 touches on the ground, and he's seen 4 targets. He's not a horrible desperation play this week. Philadelphia is facing the Jets. They're 7-point favorites. New York is a top 10 matchup for running backs in adjusted fantasy points allowed. If a positive game script hits for Philly in this one, which is entirely possible, then Gainwell could see 8 to 10 touches. Now, similarly, we have Tajay Spears. He's still rostered in just 39% of Yahoo leagues. That's despite being one of the best handcuffs in fantasy football and finishing as a top 30 PPR running back in back-to-back weeks. Negative game scripts favor Spears more than his teammate Derrick Henry. According to Fantasy Life, Spears has played 81% of Tennessee's 2-minute snaps this year, and he's 5th in the NFL in running back target share. If Tennessee falls behind a very good Baltimore team, which is again entirely possible, then we might see that snap share favor Spears over Derrick Henry. So the matchup doesn't look amazing on paper, but it might end up being okay for a player like Tyjae Spears. D'Onta Foreman is under the 50% mark over on Yahoo. He makes obvious sense this week. Right now, Roschon Johnson is still in concussion protocol. And I think even if he ends up going, Foreman is still going to see some touches in the Bears offense. If Roschon doesn't go, then you're looking at a lot of volume for D'Onta Foreman. Now, I'm not sure Foreman's going to see a lot of receiving work, regardless of if Roschon Johnson goes or not. He's never seen a single game target share higher than 10%. But the matchup is just below average on paper, and Foreman should be able to see double-digit touches in this game. Maybe even if Roschon Johnson goes. I talked up Chuba Hubbard on the 15 Transaction Show this week, and how he's just been a better runner compared to Miles Sanders. And over the last 2 weeks, Hubbard's out-attempted Sanders 23-20, and they've seen the same number of targets. They get Miami this week. That could force a negative game script, and it could force more passing, as we've seen with the Panthers all year. They have a top 5 pass rate in football. That could lead to some catches for their running backs. They're an above-average team in running back target share this season. So I don't think Hubbard's a smash play because Miles Sanders is still involved, but he's at least a solid one. And then the last running back that I've got for you in this tier, Latavius Murray. The Bills are huge 14-point home favorites. They're playing a beaten-down Giants team. Latavius Murray is tied for the team lead with 6 rushes from within their opponent's 10-yard line, and he has the most at the goal line. Now, there is a chance that we see more Damian Harris than we were seeing earlier this season, but Murray's running more routes, and he has the more reliable 2023 workload. So I'd look to him as a sleeper this week as opposed to Damian Harris, because it could be a blowout. Moving on to wide receiver, Brandon Cooks is now in sleeper territory. He's rostered in 44% of Yahoo leagues, and he's been bad this year. He has a 0.69 yards per route run rate. Last year, that number was 1.64. He hasn't scored more than 6.7 PPR points in a game so far this year. Now, the good news is that his target share per game rate is still 15.4%, and the Cowboys get the Chargers this week. LA is the 7th best matchup for wide receivers in adjusted fantasy points allowed. So I don't totally mind Brandon Cooks in week 6. I also like Josh Downs again this week. He's now graduated from the below 10% tier, now into this tier, where guys are rostered in 10 to 50% of leagues. But he should be rostered in more. The Colts are facing the Jags, and while Jacksonville's been pretty average against the slot this season, Downs himself has now seen a 20.6% target share on the season. And his target share per game rate in 3 games where Gardner Minshew's played significant snaps, it's over 23%. So the volume should be there this week. Robert Woods has seen a 20% target share every game this season. Tank Dell could be out this week because of a concussion. Now, that won't necessarily give Robert Woods higher route participation, but it could funnel more targets his way. So keep an eye on Woods in a pretty average to below average matchup against the Saints. There's more in this wide receiver group in just a second. Now, the last wideout in this tier that I want to get to, Curtis Samuel. It feels like not enough people are talking about what he's been up to. He scored 18 PPR points in back-to-back weeks. He's got a 15% target share in that offense. He's played 73% of his snaps from the slot this year, and Atlanta's seen the 5th highest percentage of targets go to that area of the field. They're also tied for the league lead with 4 slot receiving touchdowns allowed. So he's got the matchup to go for a three-peat. And then at tight end, I'm going to stick with the Commanders. I'm going to go with Logan Thomas. Atlanta just struggles against the middle of the field. They're a top 5 matchup for tight ends in adjusted fantasy points allowed. Thomas has now hit a 23% target share in 2 of 4 games this season, and his route participation has been top 10, top 15 at the position. He could come back with another very good outing here in week 6. There's also Dawson Knox. Dalton Kincaid's currently in concussion protocol, and while Knox is banged up himself, he could be in store for an uptick in target share if Kincaid can't go. He hit a 16.7% target share last week, so monitor that situation. Moving on to the next tier, we'll be looking at players rostered in fewer than 10% of Yahoo leagues you could consider starting this week. And we're going to begin with Gardner Minshew. Minshew's got a revenge game against the Jags, and Jacksonville's been a plus matchup against quarterbacks this season in adjusted fantasy points allowed. The Jags have been below average in pressure rate this season, and that's good because the Colts haven't been good at stopping pressure. Minshew's shown some competence in the past. So I think he can come through with QB2 production this week. Now at running back, the only guy that I've got for you is Keontae Ingram. Well, I guess I had the Miami running backs earlier, but the only one left is Ingram. Amari DiMercado is my preferred option in that backfield, especially if Ingram can't go this week. But we should be open-minded to the idea that there's a chance that Arizona splits this backfield if Ingram's healthy. The problem is that he hasn't been that effective in the NFL. That's a big reason to prefer DiMercado. And DiMercado is also likely to get receiving reps. But we're in a range where there just aren't many running backs available. So Ingram is logical if he's healthy. Moving to wide receiver, I talked about Robert Woods just a second ago, but the player who's going to see the biggest jump in work if Tank Dell is out this week is John Mechie. Mechie hit a season-high 43% snap share this past week, and that led to a route participation over 50%. His high before this past week was 20%. Now, the matchup's not amazing, like I said earlier, but he'd be the one who actually benefits most from this Tank Dell injury, so keep that in mind. Everyone's rightfully going to be interested in KJ Osborne this week, with Justin Jefferson sidelined and the Vikings getting the Bears. But don't sleep on Brandon Powell. Powell ended up seeing a 13% target share in week 5, and with Justin Jefferson sidelined, he should see plenty of work in 3 wide receiver sets. The Vikings have the second highest pass rate in neutral game scripts this year, and they have the top overall pass rate. So there's a chance that Powell sees 5 or 6 targets. The Panthers should face a negative game script this week. That's what I talked about earlier. And that should allow them to maintain their high 2023 pass rate. Now, Adam Thielen's going to get his because he's been peppered with targets this year. But don't forget about rookie Jonathan Mingo. In week 5, Mingo played 86% of Carolina's snaps, and he had an 86% route participation rate. He ended up with a 20% target share. He's hit a 20% target share in 2 of 4 games this year. So I don't mind him in a decent wide receiver matchup. Now, finally, with our streaming defenses this week, I talked about Atlanta and Vegas on the 15 Transaction Show, so you can go in that direction. And I also think that Washington makes sense. Washington has a pretty decent advantage in terms of pressure rate and pressure rate allowed defensively. And then Minnesota is another one. This could bite you given how well the Bears offense has played the last 2 weeks. But even with that, even with how well they've played, Chicago surrendered 7 sacks over those 2 games. So the Vikings are a reasonable choice during a tough week for streaming defenses. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. Greatly appreciate it. I'll talk to you tomorrow with the weekly mailbag show and then an episode of Late Round Perspectives.